The Redmi Note 10 is a budget offering from Redmi or Xiaomi that comes in at about 95,000 naira or $170 right now, while the all-new Redmi 10 is yet another budget offering from Xiaomi that comes in at 90,000 naira or $160 for the same memory configuration. That's 4 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage here. But the newer device here, the Redmi 10, was announced about 6 months later after the Redmi Note 10. Is it still worth getting the Redmi Note 10 for an extra $10 or 5,000 naira? Or are you better off getting the newer device, the Redmi 10 itself? My name is Oscar Frank. I'm going to help you make that right purchase decision, and so without taking much of your time, yo guys, let's get started. Design is something I consider subjective as far as these devices are concerned. So as far as the design on the smartphones, both of them are made out of plastic. You have this matte and rare finish on the devices here, with the Redmi 10 being the one having the matte finish and the Redmi Note 10 having this gloss finish at the rear. Also, there is a noticeable camera bump to the Redmi 10 than the Redmi Note 10, and I actually do prefer the slimmer profile from the Redmi Note 10 than what you get from the Redmi 10. I've said a lot of Redmis already. Okay, design here is subjective and both have about the same I/O port, and they have the Gorilla Glass Protection 3 and all that. For me, I'd go with the Redmi Note 10. That's my preference here. You have an IP58 rating and it generally speaks to me. Honestly, I would say this department is a tie, and it's not that much of a difference between these smartphones in terms of the design here. So in terms of display, on the other hand, we have different technologies at play. While you get a 6.43-inch Full HD AMOLED display from the Redmi Note 10, which is of course more pleasant to look at, especially considering the better contrast ratio from the Super AMOLED panel. The Redmi 10 on the other hand has a slightly larger display, not actually that noticeable, a 6.5-inch Full HD LCD panel, but this time with a 90Hz refresh rate, making the animations and scrolling feel faster owing to that extra smoothness from the higher refresh rate. For me, since the major difference between this smartphone's displays, either you go for the Super AMOLED with a lower refresh rate or an LCD with 90Hz refresh, I most times would default to the higher refresh rate in a smartphone. That's in this kind of situation, but this time that's not the case here. I prefer the Super AMOLED display from the Note 10, which looks richer in terms of the saturation, the contrast, and the colors. So I would love to hear from you guys what you think about this. Would you go for a higher refresh rate on an LCD, a cheap LCD at that matter, or a Super AMOLED with 60Hz refresh rates? Let me know in the comment section below. Now, performance is a major reason I even consider any smartphone. I wouldn't want to have a beautifully designed smartphone that's painfully slow for my kind of situation or activities I use a smartphone for. The processors on here are quite apart in terms of the performance. From the Redmi Note 10 here, you're getting the Snapdragon 678 chipset, while the Redmi 10 on the other hand gives you the MediaTek Helio G88 processor, a less powerful processor in this comparison. As far as the RAM and memory configuration, you can get about the same thing. That's either 4 gigs 128, 4 gigs 64, and 6 gigs 128 memory configuration. You get Android 11 and MIUI 12.5 on both devices, but even at that, you can definitely tell the difference in performance, starting from the faster app launch times on the Redmi Note 10 and even how it performs or runs the applications in the background here. Even the types of memories you get from these two smartphones are actually different. You have the slower eMMC read-write speed memory on the Redmi 10 and the faster UFS 2.2 memory module on the Redmi Note 10. Now, there is no two ways to this category. There's a noticeable difference in the performance and how fast these devices perform, and the Redmi Note 10 here is actually the winner in this category. So, the Redmi Note 10 here, in terms of the camera, comes along with the 48 megapixel main sensor, 8 megapixel ultra wide, a 2 megapixel depth sensor, and a 2 megapixel macro lens. While the Redmi 10 gives you a slightly larger main sensor, a 50 megapixel main sensor, 8 megapixel ultra wide, 2 megapixel macro, and a 2 megapixel depth sensor. On the front side of things is where you get an 8 megapixel for the Redmi 10 and a 13 megapixel for the Note 10. Photos are really close here and okay for the price you're paying. But for me, there's this extra level of saturation that gets added on the Redmi Note 10 when you take a closer look at the photos. Like I always say, Samsung devices around the price point tend to give me the amount of vibrance and saturation I love for photos, and the Redmi Note 10 takes you away a little bit from the less or poorly saturated photos you get from the Redmi 10, giving you a step in the right direction. Videos on the rear cameras from the Redmi Note 10 can go up to 4K in resolution, while both cameras, the front and rear on the Redmi 10, cap out at 1080p 30 fps without stabilization. Obviously, you have more options and a slightly better camera system with the Redmi Note 10. Even though the Redmi 10 has a slightly more megapixel count for the main sensor, the Redmi Note 10 actually wins in this department also. Both smartphones run on 5000 mAh battery, but the Redmi 10 has this additional reverse charging feature and also a 22-watt fast charger from within the box, but charges at 18 watts on the smartphone. The Redmi Note 10 on the other hand has a 33-watt fast charger from within the box. But when it comes down to day-to-day use, I realized that the Redmi 10 lasted a little longer than the Redmi Note 10 in my personal test. At first, it got me a little confused as to why, because come on, you're getting a Super AMOLED display on the Redmi Note 10 and a lower refresh rate, which should consume less power, but then the Redmi 10 lasts longer. There are only two logical explanations for me as far as this device is concerned in the battery department. Either the processor on the Redmi Note 10 consumes more power, or I probably use this one the most because I think I prefer it to the Redmi 10. So one of those scenarios. Now, as far as the pricing here, price is one thing to consider when getting new devices, and for the exact configuration I have here, 4 gigs of RAM and 100 gigs of internal storage, the Note 10 here retails for $170 or 95,000 naira, while the Redmi 10 retails for $160 or 90,000 naira here in Nigeria. Both devices can be configured to 6 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage, but at that point, the difference in price is a little more than the $10 you get at this configuration. The Note 10 goes for an extra 10,000 naira or $20, while the Redmi 10 can be gotten for an extra $15 or more, depending on where you buy. So it's time for my verdict. Which of these devices should you buy if you're placed with the responsibility or task of making that decision right now? Which is the perfect smartphone for you with the best value for money? There's actually no doubt that the Redmi Note 10 is the better buy and better value for money. I don't see a reason why you should get the Redmi 10 when the Redmi Note 10 is out here and you can get it for just $10 more. Just stand back and think about it. For $10 more, you get a better display, better performance, and a slightly better build. Although I'd say the design here is subjective, but this is better in a lot of ways. And the Redmi Note 10 is the way to go when placed with the task of picking between these two devices. Okay, that's been it for this video. Sub if you loved it. Click on the like button if you found this video helpful. And also, do not forget to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as I really love to hear from you guys. I'm gonna catch you guys in the next one. Cuídate.